The life worth living question is about as big a question as you can find. It's a question that has to do with the entirety of our lives, the whole shape of what we might hope for, the kind of world that we could hope to live in, hope to contribute to. And it's daunting to face a question that big. So what do? One thing we do is we turn towards texts and voices from the past and present, from around the world, from different traditions, to help us get some traction. But these two things, the size of the question and the texts that we go to, the voices that we listen to, they give us two challenges. And what I'd like to do is walk you through one way that we address those challenges. The first challenge is this. It's just the size of the question. With something that big, where do you even start? How do you get any traction at all? And the second challenge is when you turn towards different texts, different voices, you find that they're incredibly diverse. They come from different historical periods. They come from different geographical locations, different social locations. They're embedded in very different traditions. And all of that diversity can lead us to a situation where we've got no other way of relating to them than as good life grab bags, as these sort of places where we go for disconnected nuggets of wisdom. But the problem is little disconnected nuggets can't help us get an integrated vision of life. They can't help us with the big question. So what do? The good news is there's a single approach that can address both of these challenges. And that's to break down the really big question into still big, but somewhat smaller, more manageable questions. It's like breaking a long, unfamiliar word up into syllables so you can sound it out and learn how to read it. But also asking the same questions of a diversity of texts and voices helps us to bring them into an integrated conversation. Whereas if we take them on their own and treat them as good life grab bags, we just get little snippets, and those snippets maybe don't even relate to each other very much. When you ask the same questions, you get a real conversation. I'd like to take you through some of the core questions that we ask in Life Worth Living as a way of getting a handle on the big question and bringing diverse voices into fruitful, truth-seeking conversation. We start with the trio of primary questions. What these do is take the diversity of human life, the complexity of experience, and identify three dimensions or aspects of life, and then ask a big normative question about each one. So the first question is this: what does it mean to lead life well? This is a question about human agency, about our character, our actions, the way that we affect the world around us. We need to ask this question because a lot of what matters in life is how we comport ourselves, how we live, how we relate, how we interact with other people. That's the agency question. What does it mean to lead life well? If you think about it for even a second, it's not that most of life in the world is what you do. So much is given to us, so much is not chosen, so much is what we might call circumstances. And so we need to ask a second question. What does it mean for life to go well? In all those things that aren't really up to you, what's worth hoping for? What kind of circumstances contribute to a flourishing human life? Now, agency and circumstance, they make up most of the world. Either you're acting or you're receiving, you're being acted upon. And a lot of traditions of thinking about human life divide it up into those two buckets. But there's a third aspect that's really important when you're asking these questions about what makes life really worth living. And that's a question of experience, of how it feels. So we could ask, what does a good life feel like? This is a question of affect. It's not really about agency. You don't totally get to decide how you feel, but it's not entirely about circumstance either, because it's about your reception, your interpretation, and the way that the circumstances in the world around you affect your experience, the tonality of your life. Together, the agency, circumstance, and affect questions can capture a lot of our experience, what really matters to us in life. And this is one of their values, because if you ask them of a text or a tradition or of yourself, then you start to piece together a really comprehensive vision of life. Different people's answers or responses to these questions differ a lot. And they differ in two different ways. You can have different content for your answer, or you can relate the three aspects or dimensions of life differently. I'm going to take you through a really quick, almost slapdash overview of three different visions to give you a sense of how this works. You don't need to know the philosophy behind it in order for this to be valuable. And lots of what I say will be oversimplification, but it should get the point across and it should help you learn how to work with these questions in your own discernment. So our three figures will be the 19th century British philosopher John Stuart Mill, who belonged to a school known as utilitarianism. The first century Roman thinker Seneca the Younger, who was a member of the Stoic school of ancient philosophy, and the 20th century conservative Jewish rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Let's run through what each of them has to say with respect to the agency question. What does it mean to lead life well? Well, for Mill, a good life is one that tends to increase the total amount of pleasure, good feeling of all sentient beings that it has any impact on, and to decrease their pain. So good actions are actions that increase pleasure or decrease pain. A good life is one that does that in the aggregate. And it's not just your own. This isn't an egoistic philosophy. Utilitarianism, as Mill says, means you have to care about everybody who experiences pleasure and pain. Seneca has a really different answer to this question. What does it mean to lead your life well? For him, it means to lead your life according to virtue, which is to say, in a sort of harmony or accordance with what reason and nature tell us. There's a sort of picture of what a human being is and how a rational human being would act. A good life is one that follows that pattern in whatever circumstances happen to arise. Heschel, for his part, is coming from within the Jewish tradition. And for him, a life led well can only be one that accords with the commands of God, that performs the acts that Jews have received as the law from God since Sinai. That's really different than what you get in Mill or in Seneca. And while a lot of the good works that they might do would overlap, the vision that they're knit into because of the different answers to these questions is a very different vision. Let's move on to circumstances now. For Mill, the answer here is going to seem fairly repetitive. Good circumstances are whatever increase pleasure or decrease pain. There are as many different good circumstances as there are people's preferences with respect to pleasure and pain. A good circumstance is whatever floats your boat. Seneca has a totally different answer here. Seneca says that the circumstances question, what does it mean for life to go well, is simply irrelevant to the question of the good life. It's not actually part of the question of what makes life worth living. Circumstances are outside of your control. And as he sees it, the good life ought to be fully within your control. You can't choose whether you wind up in prison or at a banquet table. All you can choose is how you respond to your situation, and that's all that matters for a good life. Heschel, for his part, has a pretty long list. It's not reducible like Mill to one thing, and it's very relevant, unlike for Seneca. The list would include things like a long life, health, community, education, things of that sort. And he has an account of how all of these things fit into what it means to be a creature of God. Turning now to the affect question, how does a good life feel? My hunch is that by this point, you can guess Mill's answer. A good life feels good. It has pleasure, and it has the absence of pain. That's it. Seneca has a bit of an answer here. Unlike for circumstances, it's not that there's nothing that matters, but it's a very reserved answer. He thinks that if you live a life of virtue, you'll feel something like the subtle, calm self-satisfaction of a job well done. And that's how a good life feels. Heschel, again, has a more dynamic and diverse set of answers here. He'll say things like joy. A good life is one in which the life of our community and what God has done for the world give us joy. It's also the case, though, that when faced with the immensity of the world, we ought to feel a sort of awe, a sort of wonder at the grandeur of everything and at the one who created it all. So a good life doesn't just feel joy, it also feels awe. And because not everything is going well all of the time, part of a good life is going to be to mourn and lament appropriately. So there's all sorts of different things that go into how a good life feels on Heschel's account of the good life. Now, this has been all at the content level. That's only one way that different visions differ with respect to their answers to these questions. There's also different ways of relating them. Here, I'll just take Seneca and Mill because they're the two easiest ones to show the answers here. So for Seneca, as I said, the good life is 100% the virtuous life. It's all a matter of agency. That's the only thing that counts. It's the only thing that really matters. And then circumstances are entirely irrelevant. And off to the side, it's not technically part of the good life, but it goes along with it as this kind of this echo or this reflection in the form of the self-satisfaction and joy of being a virtuous person. Mill also has something he thinks is 100% of the good life. That's feeling good and not feeling bad. But for Mill, he has an account of how agency and circumstances relate to this that's really different from Seneca. Because there's not just the good life, there's the moral life, which is a life that contributes to the good life for self and others, that increases pleasure and decreases pain. And because we don't act directly on each other's feelings, we act via mediations by doing things, saying things, by changing other people's circumstances. Circumstances play a mediating role here. We act on circumstances so as to bring about feeling. And that's a really different relation than just excluding circumstances entirely. So, to summarize, if you ask these three questions, you get a pretty comprehensive account of a good life or a life worth living. But you need to pay attention to both the content of the answers and how they relate to each other, because it's very easy to wind up with an incoherent view with answers where we're picking and choosing and they don't fit together in the way that somebody like Seneca or Mill's answers do fit together, whether or not we agree with them ourselves. When we teach life worth living, we're engaging with a diversity of text from a wide array of religious, cultural, and philosophical traditions. And we use a set of course questions as a way of bringing those texts into some sort of coherent conversation with each other and helping students in their own discernment of the shape of a life worth living. That comes with some potential dangers that I want to point out for you. On the one hand, whenever you bring a framework to a text, there's a risk that you're going to have to squeeze it and twist it and at some level misrepresent it to fit it into the framework. That doesn't mean that the framework is not useful or irresponsible. It simply means that we need to be careful and help our students be careful with the ways that we relate to it. The framework of our course questions is a heuristic. It's a pragmatic tool for helping us generate good conversation. It is not the case that we're saying that every great thinker or every individual who ever thinks about the shape of flourishing life has consciously asked these questions or ought to have. It's to say that for us here and now, these questions can be orienting. And we may find places where the questions don't quite fit our readings or our conversation. And those places are educationally valuable because they show us things about the world and about ourselves that it can be helpful to learn. Here's an example. 3 of our course questions are, what does it mean to lead life well? What does it mean for life to go well? And how does a good life feel? And we suggest that pretty much everybody has an answer to these 3 questions. A response to them is just ingredient in a vision of a life worth living. But then you come to somebody like Seneca the Younger, a Stoic, who says circumstances are entirely irrelevant for thinking about the good life. when you're talking about circumstances, you're just not talking about the shape of flourishing life, because the shape of flourishing life is virtue and virtue alone. There's a case where the question does not fit Seneca at all, but precisely the fact of it's not fitting is educationally helpful. So that's one sort of caution. Remember that these are just a heuristic, and that you're going to find places where the questions, the frameworks, whatever frameworks you bring to a text, aren't quite going to fit, and those are places for learning. The second caution is that our lives themselves are very complicated, and something like that framework fit question applies to them as well. So as students reflect on their lives, they can develop a habit of thinking that every piece of life and every piece of their vision of a life has to fit neatly into the bucket of one of these questions. And it's important to remember that the actual phenomena of our lives have many different facets built into one. An example here is something like friendship. So I mentioned the three questions of what does it mean to lead life well, for life to go well, and how does a good life feel? We say those roughly correspond to three important aspects of human life: agency, circumstance, and affect or feeling. Which bucket would you put friendship in? If you want to give a serious treatment at all, you have to recognize that all three aspects are at play in a real friendship. It's something that you do. There's no friendship without your active involvement. But just because you like someone, think benevolently of them, or whatever else goes into friendship, doesn't mean you have a friendship unless that person reciprocates. There's a matter of circumstance that's outside of your control. And you can imagine something that had all the hallmarks of friendship, but the participants felt nothing. It was just blank. They didn't have the joy, the frustrations, any of the stuff that goes into a real, actual friendship. Something would be lacking, right? So this is a case where you might find a student who wants to say friendship, it belongs in one of these buckets, or whatever your framework is. We can start to squeeze the real stuff of life into our categories if we're not careful. And so we found over the years that it's helpful to both provide the frameworks and then provide ways of letting students see their limits so that they don't go around trying to force either texts or their world into a straitjacket that's really actually meant to generate reflection and good conversation. As helpful as the agency, circumstance, and affect questions are for sketching out the shape of a vision of a life worth living, they're not the only questions we can and should be asking. They don't cover it all. There's so many other questions out there. Questions like, who do we answer to? Who's the source of our responsibility to lead our lives well? What even is a human being, and what's our place in the world? How should we respond when we fail to lead our lives in a good way? And what do we make of the suffering and injustice that we find in our lives and in the world around us? Questions like these are the entryway into the really big question of what makes life worth living. Getting familiar with these questions, learning how to ask and respond to them, is the starting place for your own reflection, your own discovery of your own vision of a life worth living, and for your ability to have productive, truth-seeking dialogue with others on the question that matters most in our lives. We come to the question of what matters most, of what makes life truly worth living as human beings. It's inescapable. That's just what we are. But what it means to be a human, what a human being really is, and what our place is in the world, these are questions that great thinkers have disagreed about and that really shape our responses to that core question of what makes for good lives. Consider a couple examples here. The philosopher Susan Wolf, in trying to suss out what it means for lives to have meaning, notes that we're little specks of dust on a speck of dust in an immense, incomprehensible cosmos. And so she says, there would be something unfitting, something that didn't quite sit right if we treated our own enjoyment, our own feelings of happiness or pleasure, our own whims, as all that really mattered. And so meaningful lives, she goes on to say, are ones that engage in interpersonal projects of some positive value. There's a connection there between her sense of our smallness and her sense that our individual lives can't be meaningful if we're our own standard of the good and what matters. Another example would be this. The Jewish rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel maintains, based on scripture, that the human being is created in the image of God. And Heschel says this gives us a great dignity. And you might think, well, you infer from that we're very valuable and very important. And on the one hand, Heschel says this is true. It's the dignity of human being that gives a sanctity to our lives. No matter what we do with our lives, we have a value because of the image of the one who made us. But it also means, that dignity of our lives, that it would be a waste, that it would be unbefitting of something so dignified to live our lives in certain ways. The kind of ways that the Jewish tradition calls sin. Again, there's a question of fit between who and what we are and how we ought to live. Now, these are only two of the myriad ways that you could go about answering, and the people have gone about answering the question of what a human being is and what our place is in the world. But you should be able to see by now that how we answer that question matters, that our responses make a difference for how we live, and that we need to wrestle with our sense of what it truly means to be a human being in this world. If we're being honest, none of us ever perfectly lives up to our ideals. We all fall short one way or another, one time or another. And so it's important, as we think about the shape of a good life, of a flourishing life, to ask the question, how should we respond when we fail to live as we should? What do we do when we don't meet our own ideals, when we fall short? Now, this is really different from the kind of failure that we've learned mostly to wrestle with in our lives, which is we had a goal or a project and it didn't go as well as we wanted it to, right? You got a lower grade on the test, or that project at work turned out poorly and there's some negative consequences to that. That's a kind of failure, but it's not the kind of failure we're asking about here when we're asking about a life worth living. Here it's something deeper, something you might call personal failure, where your whole person is involved in a falling short of the shape of life that you aspire to have. Failure like this tends to affect other people. It tends to affect how we think about ourselves. And so learning how to address it wisely is an important factor of any robust vision of a life worth living. There's no one answer here that everybody agrees on. It may be really important to repent and seek forgiveness. It may just be important to figure out ways to do better in the future. We have to wrestle with those questions for ourselves, but learning how we ought to respond in those moments where we don't live up to our ideals will give us the resources we need to pick up the pieces and move on, and maybe even grow when inevitably we fall short.